This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa. In this episode 829 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting to the mailbag questions this week, I want to send yet another reminder about the Late Round Fantasy Football Patreon. With the Patreon, you get live stream Q&As, rest of season rankings and tiers, weekly rankings and tiers, a great Discord community, and more. You can learn more about it over on lateround.com. The first question this week is from Twitter. It's from @FantasyFBell. It says, it feels like tight end is deeper than ever this year with Hawkinson, Laporta, etc. Does the data support this? So there are a lot of ways to answer a question like this, because the definition of deep is subjective. But I'll look at a couple of angles here. I'll start by just comparing the tight end 18 or a mid-range tight end 2, the tight end 12, and the tight end 6 to how those players performed historically. Right now, the tight end 18 in points per game is Hunter Henry, who's at 7.4. Last season, among tight ends with 8 or more games played, the tight end 18 was at 8.4 PPR points per game. But during the 4 years prior to that, the tight end 18 averages 6.3 points per game. So we're looking better this year than the previous 5-year average, except in 2022 when the number was actually higher. That's for tight end 18. For a mid-range tight end 2, let's look at the tight end 12. This year, the tight end 12 is David Njoku. He's averaging 8.8 PPR points per game. Last year, the tight end 12 was at 9.2. And the 5-year average prior to this season has been 9.8. So this season has been worse in the tight end 12 spot, a low-end tight end 1. The tight end 6 this season is Evan Ingram at 11.6 PPR points per game. Last year, that tight end 6 was at 12.9 points per game. The 5-year average, 12.4. So from that perspective, the tight end position has actually been a little bit worse this year than previous years, especially the top 12. But that definitely doesn't tell us the whole story. On top of this, there's some VORP analysis that needs to be done. Like Mark Andrews right now is the tight end 2. He's averaging 15.4 PPR points per game. Well, the tight end 2 over the last 5 years has scored almost 17 points per game. The tight end 3 this season is basically at the 5-year average. What that means is that the whole position is essentially scoring fewer points. If the high-end players were scoring fewer points and the low-end players were scoring more points, then we could probably say the tight end is deeper. And maybe it is to some degree, given how the tight end 18 was performing. But I don't think the data is screaming that to us. Now, with that being said, you could also look at this from the perspective of hit rate. Are tight ends performing well after being drafted late in your fantasy drafts? For example, if the tight end 1 this season was drafted as the tight end 14 and the tight end 2 was the tight end 18 during the fantasy drafts, you might be thinking that the position is then deep because you got these huge difference makers late in your draft. Now, when you look at the early round tight ends, the tight end 1 in ADP, that's Travis Kelce. He's currently the tight end 1. The tight end 2, that was Mark Andrews. He's currently the tight end 2. TJ Hawkinson, he was the tight end 3 during fantasy drafts, and he's the tight end 3 right now. So none of that information would be good for the tight end is deep argument. But Sam Laporta has been a massive value. And what you might be feeling is the Laporta effect, where he was drafted late and he's giving you week in and week out production. We didn't really see that last season. When I look at my ADP database and look at expected points per game via ADP versus actual points per game, and what I mean by that is every player has some sort of points per game expectation at a particular average draft position. I then look to see which players outperform that expectation or who failed to live up to that expectation. Last season, we only had one tight end outperform that expectation by more than 3 PPR points per game. That was Evan Ingram. This season, it's looking like Sam Laporta is going to be that player who really exceeds his ADP expectation. But also maybe Cole Kmet, maybe Logan Thomas, Jake Ferguson, Dalton Kincaid, maybe Trey McBride. There's a chance that happens, and I stress the word chance. Things still have to go their way, those tight ends' way. But we at least have one in Sam Laporta more than likely. The depth that you're feeling right now at tight end, it might have something to do with like a Dallas Goedert underperforming and Kyle Pitts underperforming, even Darren Waller. All the while, some legit dart throw tight ends are doing pretty well. So those players, those middle round tight ends, they became more replaceable. And in turn, the position feels deep. So my answer is that it might be slightly deeper than what we've seen based on VORP and based on how well average draft position predicted success at the position. I don't think we're looking at some massive outlier though, unless some of these tight ends just really step it up during the second half of the season. This next question is from Abdul on Patreon, who posted that he has Kenneth Walker, David Montgomery, Jordan Addison, and Puka Nacua on his fantasy team. And then he asked how worried he should be about those players. And my answer is, I wouldn't panic, but I think there's some reason to be concerned with each of these guys. With Kenneth Walker, we saw Zach Charbonnet get a nice spike in snap share this past week. That's something that I talked about earlier in the week. Now, Walker was banged up. At one point, we didn't even know if he was going to play last week. Maybe that played a role. But Pete Carroll, after the fact, after that game, he said that they also just wanted to get Charbonnet involved more. Now, I still don't think it's time to totally panic about Walker, especially because others saw what happened last week. But I do think there's a possibility that Charbonnet sees this kind of work moving forward. He's a great compliment to Kenneth Walker. And as good as Kenneth Walker's been, Zach Charbonnet also looks good. Now, with David Montgomery, I'm actually optimistic about both Detroit backs. Jahmyr Gibbs looked awesome on Monday night. It's going to be really hard for Detroit to just go back to how they were divvying up that backfield. When Montgomery's been healthy, Gibbs has averaged like a 25% running back rush share per game. My guess is with a healthy Montgomery, that number shoots back up to like 35% and maybe even 40%. The target share piece is where things get interesting. Gibbs' target share projection without David Montgomery is honestly like close to that 20% range. Like it's elite. When Montgomery returns, I'd expect that to drop down to maybe 13 to 15%. Montgomery has not seen a lot of looks through the air when Jahmyr Gibbs has been healthy. Now, the reason I still like both of them moving forward, though, there's three reasons. One, there's contingent upside. We've already seen that contingent upside. When one of the other running backs is hurt, the running back who's healthy is a legit RB1 in fantasy. Number two, even when both guys are healthy, they can still be usable in this backfield. They can still have decent backfield shares. And that leads to number three, the Lions actually have the third best running back schedule by adjusted fantasy points allowed from here on out. So honestly, if someone's low on Montgomery because of how Jahmyr Gibbs has performed, I think that Montgomery might be a buy candidate in that case, if you can get him for a lower cost, because I think that both of these guys can be relevant in fantasy. And with Puka Nacua, everything's really tied to Matthew Stafford's health. And his health at the time of this recording is still up in the air. So that's more of a monitor situation. If Stafford's good, I'm fine with Puka Nacua. And then there's Jordan Addison. And yeah, without Kirk Cousins, Jordan Addison takes a hit. I would imagine the Vikings are not going to be as pass heavy. That's the first problem. So far this season, the Vikings are first in total dropbacks and second in pass rate. Kirk Cousins was also having a very good year. He was top 5 in completion percentage over expected. And right now he ranks 5th in PFF passing grade. Quarterbacks are going to naturally impact their pass catchers. And then with Addison, you have Justin Jefferson returning eventually. Now look, I love Jordan Addison. He was one of my highest drafted players this year. I thought that he was a really solid prospect. But environment matters. Him without Kirk Cousins, that's a downgrade. He went from a potential wide receiver 2 even when Justin Jefferson returns to probably more of a low-end wide receiver 3 into that wide receiver 4 range. This next question is from Patreon. It's from Ballgame4. It says, what's your take on the Donovan Peoples-Jones acquisition for the Lions? I see many reacting as a bad reflection on Jameson Williams and saying Williams is droppable. Are you buying the dip? Now, I don't think it was necessarily a move because of Jameson Williams, but I'm definitely not buying the dip. I said it during the offseason, and I think it's just continued thus far. The vibes around Jameson Williams have not been good. Not only is it rough when players miss their rookie season the way that he did, we don't see bounce backs happen very often when that's the case, regardless of circumstance. But when he's played, he hasn't been very good. Williams currently has a 1.1 yards per route run rate. That's worse than Jahmyr Gibbs. It's not good when a wide receiver has a worse yards per route run rate than a running back. Williams has the worst yards per route run among active Lions wide receivers. And people are saying that DPJ is a replacement for Williams. I mean, in order to be a replacement, the guy you're replacing needs to be seeing the field. Williams played less than 40% of Detroit's snaps last week. His route participation isn't steadily increasing like we typically see from a good first-round wide receiver. It actually peaked during his first game back, when he ran a route on half the team's dropbacks. Now, I'm not going to say that he's a must drop or anything, because league size matters here. Your particular league matters. And there's obviously still potential with a profile like Jameson Williams' profile. But at this point, I don't see why it's drastically different between Jameson Williams and like a Quentin Johnston. They're sort of in the same bucket. But to me, this Donovan Peoples-Jones move, it was more about the Lions' wide receiver depth and needing a little bit more on the perimeter. And yes, to potentially stretch the field a little bit, which people want Jameson Williams to do. This is a good playoff team that we're talking about. They couldn't get it with Marvin Jones. He ended up retiring. And Josh Reynolds, he's just fine. He's not a super reliable wide receiver. So it has a chance to impact not just Jameson Williams, but any secondary wide receiver on that roster. Now, to be fair, DPJ has not been very good this year, but he's flashed in the past. I think that he's an interesting flyer in deeper formats. But to me, this is not just a reflection on Jameson Williams. He's just part of it. This is a reflection on the entire group. This next question is from Twitter, is from @JustinWhiteVA. It says, how has this strong rookie class made you feel better or worse about your tight end model? It obviously nailed Sam Laporta. Thanks for that. Yeah, so I wrote a lot about my tight end model this offseason because it's brand new, and I like sharing things. I feel like that we can all learn a lot when I'm just discussing my process as opposed to just waiting and you guys seeing the results of that model. The thing with using any sort of model, though, is that you shouldn't let one season overshadow things. I can at least say that the results this year, they've been great. That prospect model, that tight end model, loved Sam Laporta. It loved Dalton Kincaid. And then it had Luke Musgrave ranked ahead of Michael Mayer. But yeah, this was a good rookie class and the model recognized that. That's all that I can ask for. But just so everyone knows, I have plans for my prospect models this offseason. I've got some ideas to revamp them and make them better and more consumable for everyone. So stay tuned. The last question this week is from @JacobDeal_film. It says, how often do we see guys like Chris Olave regress in their second season, but still go on to break out even further in subsequent seasons? So I want to start by saying this. I think we need to be a little bit careful with how we talk about Chris Olave. He has a 1.74 yards per route run rate this year. He's seen a 26.5% target share per game rate. His PPR points per game is just 12.7, yes. But he's also only scored one touchdown. And we're only halfway through the season. Those numbers are not bad. I know that they're not amazing, and we had high hopes for Chris Olave after his rookie season, but these numbers and these peripherals are not bad at all. I would anticipate, just based on his usage, for that average points per game to get better. That's the reason that he was a buy on the 15 transactions episode. Now, as I just alluded to, I have this wide receiver prospect model. I also have what I call a year two model, which looks at how well a player did during his rookie season in the NFL. It combines some of those rookie season numbers with how they looked as prospects, and it spits out a year two score. And that year two score tells us how well that player is going to perform in year two and year three. Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson, and Drake London each had a year two percentile score above the 95th percentile. Historically, players in that group give us a higher end wide receiver one season in either year two or year three at about a 50% clip, which is pretty crazy, but also probably a little bit unsustainable. But regardless, a 95th percentile score or better has captured a lot of the high end wide receivers in fantasy football. This is since 2011. Now, I decided to look at all the wideouts since 2011 who hit that 95th percentile mark. And these are wide receivers who were either drafted or who went to the NFL Combine. And for the record, like I just said, some of this is going to change this offseason. Not a ton, I just want to make things better. But it's not like this is irrelevant information. But I looked back at all of the wideouts since 2011 who had a year two score and the 95th percentile or better. And I took out players who were drafted after 2020 because they haven't played 3 full NFL seasons yet. That left me with 23 wide receivers. Of those 23, 21 ended up playing 7 or more games in year 2 during their second season in the NFL. I'm using 7 games as a cutoff just to give us a big enough sample. We don't want to look at points per game numbers when a player played 4 games. Now, of those 21 wide receivers, only 4 of them scored fewer than 14.4 PPR points per game during that second season. So basically the Chris Olave bucket right now. Remember, the season's not over for Olave, but right now he is under that 14 PPR point mark. Those 4 players who are in the Chris Olave bucket, if he were to sustain what he's doing right now, were Keenan Allen, Deebo Samuel, Jerry Jeudy, and Brandon Ayuk. We know that Keenan Allen has had an amazingly productive career. We saw the big breakout from Deebo in year 3. And Ayuk, even though it's come a little bit late, he's starting to break out. He's a very, very good player. Of that group, Jerry Jeudy looks like the worst case scenario. But I would argue that Chris Olave during his rookie season and so far this year, already better than Jerry Jeudy. To answer your question, when we're talking this caliber of player, a player as good as Chris Olave, his year 2 performance and it being where it's at right now does not mean that he's dust. It's not a huge sample, but there's not a huge sample of players who are as good as Chris Olave. I think there's some reason to be concerned about the lack of connection with Derek Carr this year, but I'm still not overly concerned long term. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And remember to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. I'll have a Late Round Perspectives episode dropping later today. Hope you guys enjoy that. Otherwise, enjoy your weekend, and I'll talk to you next week.